Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode, before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Merlin Season 1, Episode 2, Valiant. The episode in a nutshell is a brief summary of what exactly happens within this episode. Valiant comes to cheat in a tournament with a magic shield, and Merlin discovers that he's cheating, making it his job to expose him to everybody else. We're now going to go over the episode in more detail and provide our opinions on those details as we go along. Valiant arrives at a seedy shop full of seedy-looking people, and he goes through all of the wares and the people to reach Devlin. He then approaches Devlin, asking for a shield that's been set aside for him. Devlin takes him into the back a little away from the other people and other patrons at the shop, and then brings out the shield, which has coiling snakes around it and on it, and he guarantees that with this shield, he is going to win his tournament. Valiant then asks to see how it works, and Devlin chants a brief spell, which causes the painted snakes on the shield to come to life and partially release from the shield. Devlin then explains that while fighting, he's going to be able to pin his opponents down under the shield, and then he'll be able to command the snake to strike them, leaving them paralyzed, before handing the shield over and saying that the snakes are now under his command, and they will do whatever he tells them to do. They both laugh, and then Valiant orders the snakes to kill Devlin. And one of the snakes comes alive and strikes out, and Devlin collapses. Valiant then epically rides his horse through the woods, over roads, over fields, and then eventually comes to arrive at Camelot, where he goes over to the registration desk in order to register for the tournament. He puts his crest on the registration table, introducing himself as Knight Valiant of the Western Isles, and the person who registers him, welcomes him to Camelot. One of the things I like about Merlin as a TV show are that we never really have to wonder who the bad guy is. It's very upfront about it. The opening scene typically is introducing us to the villain so we know who we hate. And then Devlin. I'm wondering, based on Merlin's behavior in the last episode, if this is a trend among sorcerers, but you would think that you'd be a bit more careful about using your magic. A knight of Camelot, a knight of a country that bans magic, maybe isn't the best person to be showing your magic to. They're probably not going to care much about you. You're breaking the law and they know it. But also, too, why are you presenting somebody with deadly magical artifacts without having a failsafe to protect yourself against said dangerous magical artifact? I just feel like most people, when dealing with something that could kill you, would have thought about the fact that it could kill you, since you created it, and protect yourself against it. But obviously, Devlin, he doesn't think like that. And unfortunately, for that, he did pay the price. We then arrive at a field outside of Camelot's walls, where Arthur is having Merlin assist him with his training. They both are wearing armor, and Merlin clumsily and with great difficulty pulls out his sword. As soon as he has his sword out of its scabbard, Arthur attacks. And Merlin essentially takes a beating due to his lack of skill. Luckily, he's wearing armor, so very little harm is actually done. Arthur accuses him of not even trying and tells him that he has a tournament he has to win. But Merlin assures him he is trying. Unfortunately, that's just the best that he can do. And they continue. Merlin does manage to block a few of the hits, but for the most part, he gets his helmet rung like a bell multiple times. Eventually, Arthur, who is giving Merlin the courtesy of calling out his moves, does in fact get Merlin on the ground, and Merlin's helmet falls off. Arthur then smirks down at him and says he's braver than he looks, as most servants would have collapsed after the first blow. And Merlin asks him if it's over, but Arthur replies that that was just the warm-up. He then asks him about his mace work, while swinging the mace around, leaving Merlin to only sigh. Now, obviously, Arthur is still at this point bullying Merlin, but I love that they call back to the mace incident from the first episode, where Merlin is completely inept at using it. But also, Arthur, you saw him punch. You saw him use a mace. Why are you thinking for even a moment that he is going to be able to help you train for a tournament against other knights? We already are well aware that Merlin has a cheat, and he has that cheat because without that cheat, he is utterly and completely, unfortunately for him, incompetent. So honestly, Arthur brought it on himself as if he's not ready for that tournament because he chose to train with Merlin instead of his entourage of knights from the previous episode. Merlin makes it back to Gaius's chambers, shedding armor as he goes, making Gaius chuckle and ask how his first day as Arthur's servant went. Merlin taps his head, mentioning that he can still hear a clanking in his ears, and Gaius helps to ease him into a chair and ease his soreness with a nice, therapeutic massage. Merlin then goes on to complain about how horrible it was, and that he has to learn tournament etiquette by the morning. He then chants a spell in order to bring a book to him, and has it open automatically, and that way he doesn't have to get up or move. Gaius scolds him, tapping his head, asking what he's told him about casually using magic. Obviously, it has fallen on deaf ears, and Merlin replies that he couldn't feel his arms, and if he could feel his arms, then he'd pick up the book himself. Gaius then turns more serious, asking what he does if he gets caught. And Merlin then asks what he would do if he was caught. After a short pause, Gaius then says that he better make sure he doesn't, for both of their sakes, before returning to massaging Merlin and helping him stretch out his muscles. Merlin continues to complain, saying that he saves Arthur and ends up as a servant, asking how that could possibly be fair. Gaius confirms that fairness isn't part of it, but suggests that it could be fun, which Merlin denies, saying he should hear his list of duties. But Gaius reminds him that they all have duties, including Arthur, which Merlin discredits, but Gaius reminds him that he's the future king, and that comes with expectations and pressures, while Merlin replies that that makes two of them. Obviously, this is a nice parental scene between Gaius and Merlin, where Gaius is using his medical knowledge to help Merlin with the consequences of his new job. And then the second point I want to make about this particular scene as well is that obviously it's trying to excuse Arthur's behavior and his bullying. It's basically saying that he is mean not because there's no reason for it, but as an outlet in order to relieve the pressures and expectations of his position. Not a great excuse, but at least they're trying. Merlin brings Arthur's armor over to Gwen in order to get her help in learning how to dress Arthur in it. Gwen teaches him by dressing him up in Arthur's armor and telling him where each of the pieces goes as she puts it on. He still seems slightly confused and notes that the helmet is the only piece that he has actually figured out, which makes Gwen laugh, before asking how Gwen knows so much about armor. She then comments that she's a blacksmith's daughter and knows everything there is to know about armor, and then calls it sad, while Merlin thinks that it's brilliant, especially as he's taking advantage of that knowledge in order to learn how to put on Arthur's armor. This is especially apparent as the next day he has to dress Arthur in his armor. He, of course, struggles with putting the armor on, leading to an annoyed Arthur asking if he knows that the tournament's that same day. Merlin then asks Arthur if he's nervous, but Arthur tells him to shut up. But his face says he is very clearly nervous. Merlin then attempts to tie on his cape, and he struggles even with that before handing him his helmet, saying he thinks that he's all set. Arthur goggles at him for a bit, asking if he's forgetting something. Merlin looks at him and looks at what he's done and doesn't seem to think he's missing anything. Arthur then points out that he needs his sword. Merlin says he guesses he will need his sword, and then he goes and gets it from the rack. Arthur grabs it from his hand before marching off, clearly having had enough. But once he's out of range, Merlin looks kind of proud and tells himself that went well. Obviously, Merlin's complete haplessness in putting on the armor, even after going and getting help to tell him how to put it on properly, is very comedic. Especially when Arthur just has to stand there and deal with Merlin's incompetence, because apparently he can't dress himself. And this, of course, is a running theme we know in future episodes as well. Arthur can't really dress himself, so he kind of just has to put up with Merlin dressing him, and unfortunately, doing so poorly. At least this time. But to be fair, it is Merlin's first time putting on the armor, so putting the armor on Arthur. So mistakes or awkwardness are to be expected. We've now arrived on the tournament grounds. The stands of onlookers are full. Fans are cheering even though nobody's in the center yet. Morgana and Gwen sit in the same section as the throne of Uther, while drums beat, and then the knights file into the enclosure, 2 at a time. Merlin peeks around the entrance to watch, and Uther then arrives last, passing all of the knights who have gathered and lined up in front of his enclosure, and he stops in front of them. He then provides the tournament's opening speech, talking about putting their bravery and their skills to the test. And, most importantly, that they have the opportunity to challenge the reigning champion, his son, Arthur. He also advises that the prize is more than just this opportunity to challenge and this glory. It is 1,000 gold pieces. He then opens the chest to show off that there are, in fact, 1,000 gold pieces within it. The crowd cheers, and then the tournament begins. All of the knights file out, aside from Arthur and his opponent. Uther then comes over and claps Arthur on the shoulder before telling him that he hopes he'll make him proud. He then pats his back and makes his way over to his own throne where he can watch the festivities. Arthur gives his cape over to an attendant before he puts on his helmet and has his first fight. Obviously, Arthur wins, and then we get to watch a montage of knights fighting each other, of shield plaques being taken off the board and put on the ground, while others get moved up as the winners are determined. We mostly focus in the montage on Arthur and Valiant's fights, though there are others that are included as well. And then at the end, Arthur and Merlin watch Valiant's last fight together from the sidelines, and Merlin comments on how handy Valiant looks with a sword. Valiant then exits after he wins again, and he stops by Arthur, offering his congratulations for the day's victories. Arthur stiffly offers the same before Valiant says that he'll see him at the reception that evening before he moves on. Merlin calls him a creep, which makes Arthur snort and smile. Then, to cover his slip-up of actually finding Merlin funny, because that's not allowed, he then decides to give Merlin a list of chores that he needs done before tomorrow, and then he leaves. Now, obviously, we get Arthur reacting to Merlin's funniness, and then covering it up by giving him a list of chores, which is not very nice. We also get the first direct interaction between Valiant and Merlin and Arthur. And then a tiny little criticism. If Arthur wins, and we're pretty sure he's going to because he is the reigning champion and the main character of the show, does that mean essentially that the crown doesn't have to pay out 1,000 gold pieces? Because, I mean, Arthur's the prince. He already has access to all the money that the crown has. So then that $1,000 or 1,000 gold pieces, sorry, just stay in the family, stay with the crown, don't really actually have to be paid out. I feel like it's a bit suspicious that Arthur is allowed to participate because I feel like that'd be a conflict of interest just by the fact that the prize money. I also find it suspicious that they don't have a second or third place pot of money, only the winner gets a prize. Usually there's at least first, second, and third who get prizes. And that just adds to the suspicion that the crown, I don't think they actually want to pay out anybody. And that's why only the first place gets the prize, and the first place is most likely to be the person who is having to pay it out anyways. Very suspicious and shady. After such a busy day watching the tournament, Merlin lounges on his bed while using his magic in order to complete his chores that he was given. He studies the magic book diligently when Gaius decides to enter the room, and Merlin promptly stops all of the magic, causing all of the objects that he was working on to drop to the floor. Gaius asks him if he's using magic again, and Merlin, for whatever reason, thinking Gaius has no eyes or ears, denies it. When Gaius then points out all of the objects on the floor now, Merlin shrugs, and Gaius gives up, informing him that his supper is ready and sighing as he leaves, while Merlin instead sighs in relief. Again, we get a very parental interaction between Gaius and Merlin. Obviously, it's like, it reminds me of like when a toddler gets into the cake and they're covered in icing, and then the parent asks, "Did you get into the cake?" And the toddler, covered in icing, says, "Nope." And then he just keeps denying that, "Nope, they didn't get in the cake. They don't know who did it. Obviously, it wasn't them." That is what it reminds me of. And Gaius is just like, done with it. He's not even going to comment. Supper's ready. And I love that interaction between them. On a more serious note, in the throne room, we have all of the knights queuing up for the honor of greeting King Uther. And of course, Morgana stands beside him. Valiant comes up and greets Uther, who comments on his fighting style being very aggressive. Valiant then quotes Uther back to him with something that Uther had supposedly said at another time, off screen, that to lose is to be disgraced. Or actually, that could have been part of his speech. I didn't really pay attention to his speech, to be honest. And then Uther says he couldn't agree more before presenting his ward Morgana to Valiant. Valiant turns towards Morgana, bowing over her hand and kissing it, while she smiles at him, saying that she saw him competing today, and he tells her he saw her watching. And then he says that he understands that the champion gets the honor of escorting her to the feast, and she confirms this, and he tells her that he will give everything to win. They share a smile and a nod before Valiant goes over to shake hands and greet some of the other knights who had been presented before him. Morgana, of course, watches him leave. Arthur then steps up to Uther and bows with a short greeting. He glances over at Valiant with dislike before greeting Morgana, who accuses him of being jealous, but he asks her, of what? Before he carries on. Morgana then turns to Gwen, saying that Arthur is being annoying, and she hopes that Valiant wins. On the one hand, escorting Morgana as a prize is a bit distasteful, but on the other hand, the expectation is that Arthur will win, so there is really little risk to Morgana, because it's most likely that her childhood surrogate brother, I guess, since she's a ward, is probably the one who is going to end up being the escort. But on the off chance that someone else won, well, knights are meant to live by a code of chivalry, so I guess even then there's little risk. But it's one thing if like Morgana agreed to it, and that's what she wanted, to be escorted by the winner. But if it's something that Uther is ordering, I still feel a bit icky about it. Though, since she seems unbothered, I won't comment on it further. Merlin now enters the armory in order to gather Arthur's armor for the day when he happens to hear some hissing. He looks around and asks who's there, because, of course, it makes sense that someone is just sitting in a corner randomly hissing. He then, after looking around, finds Valiant's shield. He bends over to take a closer look at the snakes and happens to see one of them blink. He then moves in even closer to try to get a better look when Valiant holds a sword to his chest, asking if he can help him. Merlin stumbles over his words, saying that he was just gathering his master's armor as he backs away. Valiant, of course, follows him with the sword and tells him that he'd better be on his way then. And Merlin quickly grabs Arthur's armor, leaving quickly while banging into a bunch of things on his way out. In Arthur's room, all of the armor is laid out on a table, gleaming, shiny, clean. Arthur looks at it a bit dubiously and asks if Merlin had done all of this on his own. Merlin says that of course he did, and Arthur challenges him to see if he can get him into it without forgetting anything this time. Merlin then smugly dresses him in the armor, and Arthur comments that it was much better than it had been previously, the last day. However, he does make a special point to point out a note that it couldn't have gotten much worse. And Merlin then tells him that he's a fast learner and wishes him luck. Merlin follows Arthur to the tournament enclosure. Now, couple of points on this scene. Number one, it is very bold of Valiant to leave a dangerous and deadly magical artifact just lying around in a public space where anybody, like our main character Merlin, can just happen to stumble upon it. Like, I swear there's something about magic in Merlin that just makes people dumb about hiding it. Like, it's like they want to be caught. They want to be found out. Because they do things that don't make sense. And we know it's all for the plot, but it's still just like this kingdom kills people who use magic and magical items. Maybe you should be putting in even the tiniest, littlest bit of effort to not get caught using it. And then, of course, there's the whole aspect of why didn't Valiant kill Merlin? Now, of course, I don't wish for Merlin to die. And given the 5 seasons, Merlin we know does not die. But you have a servant who's looking at your hissing shield, and you've caught them at it. And you think, I'll just let them leave. There'll be no consequences to this. It's ridiculous. It's silly. But through further thought on it, if I had to give a motivation to Valiant for not doing the obvious thing and killing the witness, it would be that most likely earlier in that, like the day before, at the end of the tournament, he stopped by to speak with Arthur and he saw Merlin next to Arthur. So he probably is aware that Merlin is Arthur's servant and that killing him would probably be pretty suspicious and probably garner at least a minimal effort of investigation, which could point back to him and his magic shield. And on a risk reward, I still think probably it would have been better to kill Merlin, unfortunately. But given the show, we can pretend that he thought, maybe that's too suspicious, maybe I don't do that. But then if nobody knew he was there and it was just him and Merlin there, even if he killed him, even if he was Arthur's servant, how would they put that back to him? And he is a knight. But I will leave that one where it is, and then make my third comment on this scene, which is that I love the interactions between Arthur and Merlin when they're trying so hard not to be friends. Obviously, we all know that they end up best friends. They are each other's destiny, two sides of the same coin. We know this, so we know they're going to be besties. But it is so funny to me when they keep trying to fight against actually enjoying each other's company, enjoying their time together, and being friends. Like they're trying so hard not to be friends, and it'll be like, give a compliment. Uh-oh, I can't compliment this person. I don't want to be their friend. Okay, I'm going to add on and tack on an insult just to make sure that they know we don't want to be friends. Oh, I found this person funny. Okay, well, to hide the fact that they're funny, I now need to give them a whole list of chores. It's ridiculous, immature behavior, but also highly amusing. Merlin once again watches from around the corner while Arthur greets the crowd for his fight. Gaius comes up behind him, asking if it's his imagination or is Merlin starting to enjoy himself. Merlin Merlin sighs with a smile, saying that it isn't horrible all the time working for Arthur before he begins watching the fight. Arthur fights his first fight, and then we are blessed with another montage of Arthur and Valiant and various other knights fighting again as wooden shields are moved on the tournament board and the losers' shields are discarded onto the ground. Then, in Valiant's fight, he manages to pin his opponent, Sir Ewan, and tells the shield to strike him. We then get to see a snake coming out of the shield and biting Sir Ewan before Valiant gets up and then slashes at him. Valiant then accepts his due applause while Sir Ewan is unconscious on the ground. Merlin then comments to Arthur, who's next to him, that he thinks he's actually badly hurt, and Gaius enters the arena with his medical supplies in order to check on him. So I realize that it is a bit nitpicky of me. Obviously, this is the first scene where we see the shield in action during a fight, but that snake, when told to strike, moved so slowly. How is it that no one in the audience noticed the snake? It also looks like the arena's in an enclosure, a circle. So there are people on all sides, except where the entrance is, watching this fight. How did they miss the snake? And like I said, the snake moved so slowly. Obviously, I know that that was for the audience's benefit so that we as the audience would get to see all of the CGI effects of the snake coming out of the shield and biting the knight. But I just cannot believe that nobody in the audience saw that snake with how slowly it was moving, how far out of the shield it had to go, and the fact that we see the enclosure and it's like a ring of people on all sides. Somebody had to have seen it. I don't believe otherwise. Now that the fighting for that day at the tournament is done, Merlin returns to Gaius's chambers, bringing Arthur's armor with him and asking how Sir Ewan is doing, and Gaius points out that there's a snake bite on his neck. It's very suspicious. Merlin points out that he was injured in a sword fight, while Gaius says that Even so, his symptoms are consistent with being poisoned by venom, and without the venom from the exact type of snake that bit him, they won't be able to make an antidote, and unfortunately, he is going to die. Merlin then notes that he was fighting Valiant, seems to come up with some sort of epiphany, and then hurries away while Gaius remains tending to his patient. Merlin then decides to stalk Valiant from around a corner and watch him carrying his shield towards his room and follows him. He spies on him in his chambers, feeding a rat to his shield. And of course, because they are eating, the snakes have come alive, and Merlin witnesses it. Merlin hurries away, but he makes some noise because being silent, unfortunately, is not his strong suit. And this, of course, leads Valiant to realizing that somebody was there and following him out of the room, sword drawn. Luckily, Merlin is familiar with the castle at this point and manages to lose him by hiding around a corner in an alcove. Merlin then returns to Gaius and reports his findings to him. Gaius believes him without question, but warns him that the king will never take the word of a servant over that of a knight, and that they cannot bring it to anybody unless the proof is completely undeniable. Merlin, in absolute disbelief, says that Valiant is cheating, asking if what he says counts for anything, and Gaius informs him that, regrettably, what he has to say counts for very little. And with the king, it would count for even less, especially if he is accusing a knight. Gaius comforts him, saying that's just the way that it is, and Merlin, understandably upset, storms off dramatically. Obviously, in this scene, our poor Merlin gets a bit of a reality check about his station in life. He may have the most awesome cheat that anyone's ever had, epic magic, but he regrettably cannot use it in the kingdom that he's in, and unfortunately, because of his station, he's not the one that's going to be believed, it will be Valiant. We also get to confirm, again, that the snakes are fully alive. They're not just images that are coming to life. They obviously need to be fed and cared for, so they are actual living creatures who just happen to be living inside of a shield right now. We now find ourselves on day 3 of our tournament. Merlin once again helps Arthur get ready while they watch his next opponent do the same, noting that he is gigantic, like a bear. And Arthur claims that he's strong but slow. Merlin then says that Arthur is fast, and Arthur, agreeing, goes off to begin his fight. Merlin walks around spotting Valiant and his shield before Gaius approaches asking how he's doing. And Merlin says he's just doing his job, minding his own business. He says this sarcastically, obviously still upset about the fact that his word doesn't matter as much as other people's. The fights go on, and Gaius offers healing to the fallen in yet another tournament montage. Once Gaius has offered his healing to the fallen, he then goes and finds Merlin again, and while looking at the final tournament board, Merlin notes to Gaius that Arthur is going to have to fight Valiant in the final. And he is sure that Valiant is going to use his shield in order to kill Arthur, and then he walks away. Obviously, in this scene, Merlin's sarcasm is a bit passive-aggressive because he's still sore about being told that his word doesn't matter. But that is an unfortunate reality of the time period. Of course, as we learn in future seasons, really in the future that's not going to matter as much, but he's still new. He hasn't built those relationships or those trust with other people, so he can't really expect for his word to rise above what his station would normally indicate it to be, unfortunately. Merlin watches over Sir Ewan, who is still unconscious in the bed, when Gaius enters his chambers and comes over admitting that Merlin was right, and they simply can't let Valiant get away with this. But unfortunately, Uther will not believe either of them over the word of a knight. Merlin then reminds him that they don't have any proof, and Gaius suggests if they could just cure Sir Ewan, that he could then tell Uther. Uther would believe another knight, but he just doesn't know how they can get that. Merlin, once again having a bit of an epiphany, quickly gets up and leaves without telling Gaius anything about his plan. Merlin then peeks into the tournament banquet, where he confirms that Valiant is currently being toasted, while Uther is asking him if he thinks he can beat Arthur. Valiant, of course, says that he hopes to be a worthy opponent, and is invited to stay with Camelot, win or lose, after the tournament, as Uther says that they could do with more knights like him. Knights like him, using magic to cheat. Seeing that he's occupied, Merlin then makes his way over to Valiant's rooms, and using a spell, he unlocks the door, and then goes and picks up a random sword from a rack that just happened to be there, and approaches the shield. He begins to hear Valiant coming, because I guess that was the very tail end of their conversation between him and Uther, and he ends up distracted, which the snakes take advantage of and begin to try attacking him. Luckily, he managed to cut off one of the heads and drop the sword. He picks up the severed head as he runs away, and he quickly returns to Gaius, who drains the venom from the snake head in order to start preparing the antidote. Now that they have the proof, now that Ewan is going to be waking up soon, Merlin then says that he is now going to go and tell Arthur, and Gaius gives him the snake head, saying that what he did was very brave. I would consider it somewhat stupid because you are breaking and entering, and that is poor behaviors. Obviously, also, he let himself get distracted and almost got bit by the snake himself, which would have also been a poor outcome. He did do the smart thing, though. He did confirm that Valiant was in a conversation and distracted. Unfortunately for him, he happened to overhear the very tail end of the conversation, seemingly, as Valiant, a few moments later, was heading to his room after Merlin had just got there. So it seems like Valiant left literally less than a minute after he left and confirmed that he was there. And then, of course, there's the whole tension of the scene. Like, it's not just comedy. There's also that tension of he almost got caught. He's sneaking around. We are worried about him because we don't want him to get caught because by this point we like him as a character and we want him to have all of the successes. So there is that factor of, oops, almost got caught, and there's a good chance that Valiant probably knows who it is because who other than him knows about his shield? There really is only one other person, so obviously Merlin would be prime suspect. But again, for whatever reason, he isn't going after him or trying to kill him. Merlin approaches Arthur, who is eating his meal in his chambers, and shows him the snake head, saying that he cut it off a Valiant's shield. Arthur, of course, expresses disbelief, both that Merlin could be the one to cut it off, and that Valiant's shield has living snakes living in it. But then Merlin asks him, has he ever seen snakes like this in Camelot? Arthur, of course, examines the head, and seemingly he's never seen it before. Merlin then promises that Sir Ewan, when he wakes up, will be able to back him up, and that Gaius is currently working on the antidote. Arthur is reluctant to believe him, but as he examines the snake head again, he asks Merlin if he's sure. Merlin then self-deprecatingly decides to tell him that he knows he's only a servant. He knows his word doesn't mean much, but he wouldn't lie to him. Arthur makes him swear that he is telling the truth, and then says that he believes him. Well, unbeknownst to either of them, there is a snake on the rafters, and it's been watching them. Valiant is then escorted across the courtyard by some knights into the throne room, where Merlin is standing next to Arthur, while Gaius, in his chambers meanwhile, is treating Sir Ewan, who does manage to wake up, and he immediately reports that there was a snake on the shield just as they had hoped, and that it had come alive, and that is what bit him. Gaius warns him that he's still very weak, as the venom is still in his system. Ewan says that he needs to warn Arthur, but Gaius settles him, saying that Arthur has already called an audience, and he should rest until they come to talk with him. He then leaves the patient unattended to go and get more herbs. And of course, while he is gone, a snake slithers onto Ewan's bed, and Ewan passes away. Uther, back in the throne room, enters and takes his spot on the throne. He then asks why the court was summoned. Arthur steps forward, saying that he believes that Valiant is cheating with magic. Valiant, of course, denies this, and Uther asks Arthur if he has any evidence. So Arthur then gestures over to Merlin, who hands Uther the snake head. Gaius returns to his chambers meanwhile, and starts to mix a potion for Sir Ewan, but finds that he has already passed on. Meanwhile, back again in the throne room, Uther asks to see the shield, and he inspects it, while Valiant tells him that it's just an ordinary shield. Because we all know otherwise that he was going to make the snakes come alive so that Uther could see it. Obviously, the shield's going to be dormant, and Uther really should have known that. But at any rate, Gaius hurries into the throne room, whispering for Merlin, while Arthur says that they need to speak to Sir Ewan. Arthur then agrees with me and makes the claim that Valiant, of course, isn't going to let anyone see the snakes come alive. So Uther then asks if he has any other proof. And Arthur then tells him that Sir Ewan has received the antidote and can confirm the use of magic. Uther asks to see the witness, but when Arthur turns over to Merlin and Gaius, he then learns that Ewan is dead. And he then has to tell Uther that he's dead. Uther then decides that the word of his son isn't enough, that the proof of the snakehead isn't enough, that the fact that Valiant didn't make the shield come alive while he was holding it wasn't obvious, and that there is no support at all for the allegations. He then asks Arthur if he saw it himself, and Arthur replies that he hasn't seen it himself, but that his servant fought one of them, hence the snakehead that he had just given to Uther, sorry. Uther is absolutely shocked that Arthur would make allegations towards a knight on the word of a mere servant. But Arthur defends Merlin, but Valiant steps in. Valiant steps in and asks if he's going to be judged on hearsay from a mere boy. Merlin stupidly interrupts and is nearly arrested because his ego's been a little bit bruised before Valiant, of all the people present, steps forward and says that he's sure Merlin was mistaken and he wouldn't want him punished on his account. Uther takes this as a sign of the true knight's behavior. He's being gallant. He's being honorable. And Valiant then turns it on Arthur, saying that if he made the accusations out of fear of fighting him, he'll accept his withdrawal from the tournament. Uther then also turns to Arthur and asks if he wants to withdraw. Arthur, of course, declines, and Uther asks what he's to do about the allegations. Arthur then covers himself and says, "Oh, there's just been a misunderstanding. I'm going to withdraw this allegation. I apologize." And then he apologizes to Valiant, who accepts before storming out as if he was insulted. Merlin and Valiant then lock eyes before Merlin glances to Gaius and then follows Arthur out. Now, this is the confusing thing to me. Merlin goes and finds Arthur and he's having dinner. Literally, just a few minutes ago, before he got the snake head and brought it to Gaius, Arthur was at the reception with Uther and all of the knights, sitting at a table filled with food. Why does Arthur need to eat again? I feel like the timeline here, somebody was confused. Somebody in the staff was completely confused because we just saw Arthur eating at the banquet, little reception, and now he's eating dinner again when Merlin goes to find him, and it's supposedly the same night. So I'm a bit confused. But that's a minor thing. Also, I find it really interesting. Honestly, up until this scene, I thought that the snakes were trapped on the shield. Like, obviously, at first, we only see them coming out partially. And they supposedly started as drawings that were then animated, so it would make sense that they would have to stay attached to their medium. But now we have learned through this scene that the snakes are actually fully free moving, and Valiant can use them to spy on anybody who wants to at any time, which is very disconcerting. And just imagine what he could have used that for if he had actually managed to keep his shield a secret and maybe not left it out in the public so that Merlin would be onto him. But that, of course, is a never going to be, because he first decided, instead of keeping it in his rooms like he did later, that he was going to leave it in the public armory room. But no one ever claimed that people who use magic are smart. Now, Uther, I forgive him. He sucks, but he's a victim of the times. This is a world where there is differences in station and that those are relevant and actually matter. And so, of course, he's not going to take a serving boy's word over a knight's, as much as we as a modern audience are like, just because he's a knight doesn't make him any better or more honest. In that time period, Uther can't really be blamed for following the will and cultural norms of his society as the king. So we forgive him for it. But the biggest question that I have is, why is Valiant sparing Merlin multiple times here? Honestly, in the room, in the armory, fine, fair enough. Merlin is there, getting a shield, and he knows he's Arthur's servant, so he doesn't maybe want to kill him, because that may come back and may look suspicious on him. But here is the perfect opportunity. He is being arrested, actively being arrested. That's his problem done. He's made his accusation. No one's believed him. He is about to be arrested. Let him be arrested. And we've already established that his shield snakes are independent. So here's what I'm thinking. If I was Valiant, who is obviously a villain, he's killed people before. We've seen it. He killed the shopkeeper who made him the shield. You let Merlin get arrested. While he's in the cell, unable to run away, you send one of your snakes. Oh, and he's in the cell. While he's in the cell, not only can he not run away, he also won't have any weapons because he is in jail. You send one of those snakes because they are independent from the shield, and you have the snake bite him. Now, yes, he's going to die of a snake bite, so suspicious given his accusations, but Uther doesn't care about him. Uther's not going to look into it. Arthur's already pissed off at him. He's made him look like a fool. He's probably not going to care. Whatever investigation is done is likely to be very minimal. His body is probably just going to be put out like trash because he is a serving boy and this is the times. This is why his word wasn't worth anything. In the same breath as his word not being worth anything, unfortunately, neither would his life at this particular moment. Obviously, that will change. And we as an audience care, naturally. But Merlin's out of the way, the one person who knows is out of the way. The next day, you're going to fight, you're going to win, you're going to kill Arthur, you're going to get everything that you want. You're going to succeed. So why are you sparing Merlin? Why are you stopping him from being arrested? Why are you letting him stay free and interfere with your goals? This is what I don't understand. And even the like locking eyes together, like a challenge. Like, come stop me. Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Valiant makes no sense and he deserves to lose because honestly, he's a dum-dum. Merlin, of course, followed Arthur out of the throne room, and Arthur is moping. He's being mopey around his chamber. And then Arthur tells Merlin, who's followed him, that he believed and trusted him, but he made him look like a fool, as if Merlin was the one who killed Sir Ewan. Merlin says he knows it didn't go to plan, but Arthur yells at him, saying that he's humiliated him, and now everyone thinks that he's a coward. Merlin tries to calm him down, says that they can still expose Valiant, but Arthur fires him instead, saying that he needs a servant that he can trust. Merlin protests that he can be trusted, but Arthur kicks him out anyways. Merlin then leaves, and Arthur goes back to his moping. This is a sad scene. They were just starting to seemingly get along. Arthur was showing trust in Merlin, and now, never mind being friends, Merlin's been fired. However, I am a little bit upset with Arthur here. It's not Merlin's fault that Sir Ewan died. If anybody's, it's Gaius's, because Gaius left him unattended. Gaius was the one who was supposed to be curing him. Merlin and Arthur were together at the time, so obviously Merlin didn't kill Sir Ewan. And had Sir Ewan not died, everything would have worked out. So I don't understand why Arthur's so upset about Merlin. He trusted him. There's nothing yet that, well, I guess he could believe that Merlin lied to him. But I just don't feel like that's something that Merlin's character that we've seen so far would do, and Arthur's also seen his character. But they had only known each other for a few days, as it was mentioned at the start of the episode that it was Merlin's first day just before the tournament, so we can forgive Arthur for it, but I do think it's a bit shitty to just suddenly turn on him after trusting him, especially when he hasn't actually broken his word yet, definitively. Merlin, of course, he's upset. He's just been fired. So, naturally, he needs to vent about it. And he goes to visit Kilgara's cave. He yells for Kilgara to come, but Kilgara does not appear. So he tells the Void that he's just going to say what he came to say. And then he yells out that whatever Kilgara thinks his destiny is, or what he's supposed to do, he's got the wrong person. That's it. Goodbye. Merlin then turns to leave when Kilgara's voice comes out of the void of the cave, saying if only it was so easy to escape one's destiny. Merlin asks how it can be his destiny to protect someone who hates him. Kilgara then lets him know that a half can't hate that which makes it whole, and Merlin accuses him of speaking in riddles. Kilgara then tells him that their paths lie together, is but a truth, and that this is not the end, but in fact the beginning. While Merlin yells at him to give him a straight answer, but Kilgara has already flown off, so he turns and he leaves. Now, I'm going to bring up the fanfiction again because, again, they make it so easy. A half cannot truly hate that which makes it whole, or that his and Arthur's paths lie together is but the truth. They make it so easy. Obviously, you should never trust somebody who speaks in riddles, as riddles are meant to deceive and mislead, and therefore people who speak in riddles can't be trusted. So, Kilgara, obviously, those of us who know the future, know that he's a person who speaks in riddles. However, in this case, I think Merlin's kind of in the wrong. He's not speaking in riddles. He's being very, very clear. Merlin plus Arthur equals destiny. You cannot escape your destiny. It's spelled out. It's black and white. It is not a riddle. I don't understand what Merlin's confused about here. Not at all. But no, there's absolutely no way that I can think of the words that Kilgara said as a riddle when it is so obviously, like he's literally spelling it out as easy as ABC. So Merlin in this case is in the wrong because Kilgara is definitely not speaking to him in riddles. It is now Merlin's turn to mope. He mopes on the castle steps out in public, not in his room like Arthur, and Gwen happens to see him, and she sits next to him, asking if he's all right. She then asks if Valiant is actually using magic, if what he said was true, and he nods. She then asks him what he's going to do about it, and he asks her why everyone thinks it's down to him to do something. She then tells him because he needs to show everyone that he was right and that they were wrong. Fair. He then asks how he does that, and she says that she doesn't know. Merlin gazes around, and then he sees a statue of a dog with its paw on a shield. And then he gets his inspiration. He runs over, and he immediately tries lifting it, but he can't. So he asks Gwen if she has a wheelbarrow. He wheels the statue into Gaius's chambers, who asks him what he's doing with this random dog statue. He says he's going to let everyone see the snakes for themselves before wheeling the statue into his room. He gets out his magic book from under the floor and casts a spell, which doesn't work. And then he casts it again, and it doesn't work. And he continues trying to cast it, but it doesn't work. Now, I find the fact that he gets so inspired by a dog statue amusing. But here's the thing. Our premise is that Merlin is the most powerful warlock and sorcerer to exist. That his magic he was born with it. It's more powerful than anyone's. It's instinctive. It's elemental. This is what we were told in episode 1. Now, he wants to try a spell, and he fails, and he fails, and he fails again. Now, I understand that even with all of his power, he's untrained. It's raw, it's potential. But you'd think if he has as much power as he actually has, that he might find magic a little bit easier than the average sorcerer or warlock. You might assume, reasonably so, that a couple tries maybe to get the pronunciation right, and then it would work because obviously power isn't his issue. He's the most powerful. So it would just be, a minor tweakment of the pronunciation to make sure that the spell works. But here he is struggling, struggling, struggling. And I'm just like, you've set the premise that he's an awesome cheat warlock, with the most powerful, born with his magic that's instinctive, and now you're having him struggle needlessly on a spell. I know it's for the tension. I get that. But I also feel like authors or script writers should stay true to the character premises. If you are setting a premise that a character is ultra powerful, then when push comes to shove, he should show that. If you want to add tension, do it in a way that where he can't use magic or something like that, but don't make it be we're just going to nerf his cheat for like a scene and then it's going to get it back in the next episode or in future episodes, but this time we're just going to forget about it. That kind of it's the suspension of disbelief. That thing as an audience that we do to believe in what we're seeing even when it's a fantastical scenario. I feel like it breaks that suspension of disbelief when you go against your own character's premise or personality or have them acting in a way or experiencing things in a way that don't make sense to the very character premise that you yourself, as the author or scriptwriter, set. The night before the big fight, Morgana has a nightmare about Arthur losing against Valiant. She then hears a clinking sound from outside. She goes over to her window to watch as Arthur practices in the dark. Merlin, of course, also continues practicing and failing his spell. Merlin then goes to Arthur's chambers and is told by Arthur that he was kicked out, but he stays and begs him to withdraw as he knows that he'll die if he fights. Arthur then tells him that he can't withdraw, as the people expect the prince to fight, and no one will follow him in battle if he proves to be a coward. He calls it his duty to fight. Merlin then leaves, and Arthur continues to brood in his room. Merlin then falls asleep with the book open on his lap, and drowsily wakes up to try the spell yet again. Meanwhile, Valiant sharpens his sword, while Arthur looks at the throne from the enclosure while it's empty before the audience has arrived. And then Morris, who we met in episode 1, puts on his armor as he's fired Merlin. Morgana arrives and kicks Morris out so that she can help him, saying that she used to help her father with his armor before he died, and then hands him his helmet. He starts to leave, but she calls his name, telling him to be careful. Somberly, he nods at her, replying that he'll see her at the feast. Arthur then enters the enclosure where Valiant is already waiting, and looks to Uther, who nods at him. He and Valiant both put on their helmets and enter into a ready stance to begin their fight. In his room, Merlin is still trying to get the spell, finally succeeding. But then he gets chased out of his room by a now living dog who isn't very happy with him. As he is leaving, Gaius happens to be returning back to his chambers, saying that Arthur is already fighting Valiant, and Merlin says that he knows and he's on his way, but he warns Gaius not to go into his room, and he'll deal with it later. Gaius, of course, is a bit confused, a bit curious. He hears the thudding in the room and decides to look in, but immediately has to shut the door when the dog attacks him too. Obviously, this is not one scene, but a small collection of snippet scenes as we prepare for the fight the night before and in the morning of. Obviously, well, not obviously, I haven't mentioned it before, but the soundtrack to these particular scenes that kind of plays as over it is worth calling out, worth shouting out. It was a very good piece of music that they chose for this soundtrack and this part. Obviously, we're going back to the Gaius and Merlin as parental figure and child of said parental figure, their relationship like that. Parents don't usually listen to their kids when they tell them to stay out of their room, and Gaius, it appears, is no exception. And I feel like it's just instant karma that he opens the door and then, oh, big dog, has to slam it shut. We now arrive at our tournament final. Merlin, of course, arriving late as the fight is currently ongoing. He peeks around his corner as Arthur is fighting against Valiant. Valiant and Arthur, they continue to fight back and forth, losing their helmets at some point. But the battle continues, and Merlin watches from the sidelines, biding his time until just the right moment. When that moment arrives, Merlin says his spell, and he makes the snakes come alive from the shield. Valiant is confused, asking the snakes what they're doing as he didn't summon them yet. But everyone has now seen, and Uther stands saying he really is using magic, while Arthur tells him that they now see him for what he really is. Having nothing to lose now, Valiant sends the snakes off to kill Arthur, who at some point has lost his sword. Luckily, Morgana takes the sword from the knight who is sitting next to her, and throws it to Arthur, who happens to catch it. He then kills the snakes before disarming Valiant and running him through while whispering to him that it looks like he'll be going to the feast after all. The crowds cheer, and Arthur makes eye contact with Uther and Morgana before leaving the enclosure and patting Merlin on the shoulder as he passes. In this scene, of course, Arthur was totally vindicated, and by association, so was Merlin. Everyone can now see they were right. Arthur was never a coward. Merlin's word is worth something. And it felt good. As an audience member, it felt good that they got caught. Of course, Valiant died, but as he has killed multiple people and he had no remorse, we're not sad about it. And we enter into our final scenes. There, of course, is a banquet ongoing. A banquet which Arthur enters as Uther announces him as the champion. Arthur gives awaiting Morgana his arm and escorts her into the banquet hall. Merlin, who is off to the side, mentions to Gaius that Arthur gets all the glory, and Gaius says that he owes it all to him. By him, he means Merlin. Arthur and Morgana are actually getting along well until she mentions the fact that she saved him. And he denies it, saying he'd have thought of something without her, which of course leads to an argument, and Morgana goes off to complain to Gwen, while Arthur then makes his way over to Merlin, asking if he can believe Morgana thinks she saved him, like he needed any help. He then says that he made a mistake sacking Merlin. Merlin says he can buy him a drink and they'll call it even, but Arthur says he can't be seen buying drinks for his servant. Merlin gets a nice slow smile on his face as he realizes that he's been rehired. Before the moment is ruined, as Arthur starts listing all of the chores that he needs done now that Merlin's been rehired. I like how the world just seems to right itself at the end. Arthur and Morgana, they start becoming friendly, but the world has to right itself, so they immediately get into a fight. Morgana goes over to Gwen, her trusted servant, and I absolutely love and adore the way that Arthur immediately beelines to Merlin. And then, of course, Merlin, who is fired, now has his job back, so everything at the end of the episode is just as it was at the beginning, for better or worse. And now we're at the part of the episode where we rank the episode. Obviously, we are going to be using two ranking lists. One that is personal, which is based purely on my feelings and entertainment throughout the episode, and then one that's mostly objective, which uses a set chart in order to determine the score absent of emotion, though it's mostly objective as bias and judgment are still involved. So on the screen we have our mostly objective rank values. I've highlighted those which I feel personally apply. Obviously, we have our character introduction of our single episode supporting character, Valiant. We also then have some multi-season supporting character development in that Gwen's father is revealed to be a blacksmith. We're learning something new about her, developing her character a bit more. We also then have our multi-season main character growth, and this I believe is Arthur, who is showing that he has trust in Merlin. And then also later, when he realizes that firing him was a mistake, when he realizes that his trust was placed where it was meant to be. So with these, that's one for the single episode Valiant introduction, 3 for the development of Gwen's character, and then 4 for Arthur's growth, which brings us to a total of 8. However, there is one negative that I would like to note, and that of course is character regression. Character regression, of course, is when a character who is capable of something in one episode suddenly finds himself incapable of something in the next one. Or they have a personality growth that they then back out on. In this case, obviously, Merlin, his character was established to be the most powerful warlock of all time. He is magic personified. and yet it takes him all night to learn a single spell. Now, I know his magic is more instinctive and elemental, but again, power shouldn't be his issue. And if it was an issue with pronunciation, he should have been able to fix that in 1 or 2 tries. So the fact that it took him all night is just ridiculous given this premise that he was set up to be such a powerful character. And so that's a -1 to this episode, and that leaves us with a total of 7 out of 10. So, obviously, this episode wasn't as good as the first one, objectively speaking, well, mostly objectively speaking. And so, our current ranking list for season 1 has the Dragon's Call in first place and Valiant in second place. On my personal list, spoiler, this is no different. The Dragon's Call was the better episode to me personally, and therefore retained its spot at number 1, while Valiant is in spot number 2. Obviously, the reason that it's there is that it was a completely average episode for an average score of 5. There were some good moments, but honestly, when I think of my overall amusement, it wasn't there like it was in episode 1. I was still amused and entertained, of course, but not as much. And just objectively, well, not even objectively, just emotionally, I didn't get the same level of feeling for this one as I did for the previous one. So again, average episode, average score, 5 out of 10. And then we come to our series ranking so far. Again, with each season, we rank the episodes against each other within that season, but then we rank each season against its other seasons in order to determine which seasons were the best. Because there are 13 episodes in the season, that's a maximum score of 130 points. We scored the mostly objective at 7, so that's gone up to 17 out of 130. And on the personal side, we've added 5, and this brings us to a total score of 14 out of 130. Once we finish the entire series, we'll know the percentage score of each season and which episode, or rather which season, is better. But with that, we've now rewatched and ranked Merlin Season 1, Episode 2, Valiant. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.